Today's guest is Jamie V. Parker. Jamie is founder of Process Plus Results, which provides people leadership development for lean practicing organizations. With 17 years of multi unit operations management experience, Jamie specializes in helping operations managers build engaged and adaptable teams that integrate improvement into their culture and overcome their most pressing challenges. Here's our interview with Jamie. Jamie, welcome to the podcast. We briefly touched on who you were in the intro, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you do, and how lean and continuous improvement is a part of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to be here with you today, Chris. And, really my story is that I am a recovering command and control manager. So I grew up in operations management where you really like hit your number, right? Hit your numbers, hit your numbers, hit your numbers. And it almost didn't matter how. And so I would push and push and push because it was the only way I knew, right? I didn't know any better. And so I kind of just viewed um, like leadership really as management. And I remember telling people like, gosh, it's not this hard, right? Like employment is a contract. We agree to pay you this much money every 2 weeks. You agree to basically do what we say. This isn't that hard. And so that's how I grew up. And lean was part of my transition and transformation from a leadership when I really started getting into respect for people and continuous improvement, along with some of my personal journey. And so, kind of gone through this journey over the last 10 years to now today.
Okay, good deal. Well, before we get started in the interview, I always ask podcast guests to share with us a quote or a mantra from a favorite leader. Can you tell us what your quote is and why you chose it?
Yeah, so I actually want to share a quote from Matt Wyatt, who teaches at the Chapman and Company Leadership Institute. And years ago, I was attending leadership classes there. And he said, this is what he said. He said, trust is a generative act. You have to give it to receive it. And this was just really a big shift for me in my thinking, because if you go and Google quotes about trust, here's what comes up. Trust is earned. Don't lose it, right? Like all of this stuff about this trust being this thing you have to earn, and then you have to be really careful because it's going to disappear at the first sight of, disagreement or issue or failure. And so this was just so different, is that, hey, as a leader, we give trust first. We don't wait for someone to earn it from us.
That is absolutely true, and everything that I've learned in my own experiences is it's like I've also found that when along the lines with that, when you're feeling mentally frustrated or you're concerned or whatnot, that's you focusing on yourself. And if you take that focus off yourself and put it on the people that you're leading, that's when things get better for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Mentally, physically, emotionally. So that's absolutely true about trust is something that you got to give it to get it. All right,
Yep.
good deal. Well, one of my goals of this podcast is to help other lean leaders resonate with your experiences. So can you kind of tell us how you took the profession on with lean and continuous improvement, kind of your transformation story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I told you how I started. And so what happened is I actually got a promotion. So while I was in this command and control manager role, I was still getting promoted quite a bit. So it got a promotion to a new division in the organization, and they were just starting to dabble in lean, right? They said, hey, here's the book, The Gold Mine, go read it. This is what we're doing, right?
Great book.
Yeah, and so this is where it started, and it really, like, it made sense to me in my head. Like, this makes sense. Okay, I can understand how this can help us deliver more value, how we can get more work done. All of this makes sense. And so I was getting some of these results, these initial results with improving quality and improving output and things like that. But what I noticed several years in is that we were really kind of stuck, because while we had some of these results, it really felt like we were dragging people along. I don't get this. This is making things so much better. Why don't people want to do this? And what I learned is that what we were saying didn't match what we were doing, because we spent all of this time changing the way we worked on the floor, changing the way our processes work, changing the workflow, changing our layouts, changing our systems, right? And putting in Kanban pull systems and all of that. But what we didn't change was the way that we led. right? Well, yeah, we might do gimbal walks. I'm going to put air quotes. If you're listening, I'm putting air quotes. We might do gimbal walks or tiered meetings or Kaizen events. But we would say things like, oh, blame the process, not the person. And then we'd have a high profile failure. And what did we do? Who ran the job?
Yeah.
Right? We would say, oh yeah, we want daily improvements, and you run the work, you're closest to the work. We want your ideas. And someone would share an idea, and we would explain why it wouldn't work. And we would say, gosh, we want to really focus on process improvement and being proactive. But then as leaders, we were in firefighting reactive mode. And so what we were saying didn't match what we were doing. And this disconnect really created a gap for us where we kind of just hit this wall. And so the only way for us to go further, the only way for us to make a difference, to create a cultural change, to change so that lean wasn't just this thing we were doing on top of everything else, but it was a way of thinking, who we were, is that we had to change our leadership. We had to change how we were showing up day in and day out with our people.
Yeah, I think that people, the gap that they hit or the wall they hit is when you can put a lot of physical tools, like hardware in place from that standpoint. But until you understand that continuous improvement is a people operating system, right? Where it's like the software piece of that. You're only as good as a tool will get you with the thinking that you have, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've had a lot of success. Can you share with us what you consider your biggest setback with lean, or what your biggest struggle was, and kind of what you learned from that, and any pitfalls or mistakes that you want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, so I have like story after story after story. I was really a slow learner with this idea of doing lean to people. And it started out with the very obvious, right? Like things like 5S, and we would go and decide, where do things need to be? And we weren't doing 5S, we were just saying, here, go do this, right? And so starting there, but even it's like, oh, I learned that lesson, I'm not going to do that again. But then, I can remember saying, oh, we're going to practice leader standard work. So we were, as a leadership team across all 18 plants, all of our leaders, we were reading David Mann's book, right? Creating a Lean Culture. And so we think we're ready for leader standard work. We think that's what we need next. But then what we did, we got, somebody from 5 or 6 plants, right? A plant manager from 5 or 6 plants to come together. And now we have this project team, and I was leading it. I was the leader. So now as a project team, we built these leader standard work checklists, and we decided what leaders needed to do at 3 or 4 different levels. And so we had these tiered checklists, and then we implemented it, and it was a complete flop, right? Never took off, never really went into practice anywhere. And it wasn't, until a couple of years later, I really realized, gosh, I keep doing this, because leader standard work is not about the output of the checklist or the activity. It's about the process that the leader goes through in figuring out what are their challenges, what are the activities they should be doing, what are the obstacles that are standing in their way. And so it's the problem-solving process, it's the iterative process that the individual leader or that a group of leaders is going through in their own work. That's the value of leader standard work, not the friggin' checklist, right?
Yeah.
And so, it was just one of those things where gosh, man, that was a hard lesson. I feel like I just had to keep learning it over and over.
Yeah, my dad is a professor of surgery, and one of the things that his students would always say, and I heard it too growing up, was, you need to learn a new mistake because you've perfected this one. You've got it down pat. You need to learn a new mistake because you've got this one. I think my own experience with teaching and leading and trying to help people form leader standard work is. Leader standard work is not about standardizing the leader's work for them. It's about teaching them to standardize their own work, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, it's your checklist, not mine. I need you to tell me what you need to have on it. And all I'm here to do is help you spot the blind spots or the corners where you may not be thinking about things.
Yep, absolutely.
Good deal. On the flip side of that, there's got to be a nirvana moment. There's got to be like an aha, I've got this with continuous improvement. What's your aha moment with your continuous improvement journey?
Yeah, so I remember so we were kind of putting together training and things and having videos and testimonials and things that were being done in different plants across these 18 plants. And Jen was a team member out in California, and she did this video. She had been doing some improvements, and she made this little video where she showed some improvements she made at work. And, she took out 3 steps here and she did this work. And then she told the story that she said, and I took 5S home. She said, we're taking care of my dad, right? He's sick and he's bedridden. And I noticed that us and the caregivers, we were putting stuff all over the place. And so we 5S, we figured out where should things go, where would it make it easier, so that we always had things, we never ran out of things. It took us less time to care for him, which meant when I was there with him or when my mom was there with them, that they had more quality time with my dad, right? And so that was that moment where I'm like, gosh, this stuff, man, this is a big deal. And it really helped me to understand, in continuous improvement and lean, like we love process, right? Like, man, process mapping and the 8 process waste and process improvement, and we process. And the thing is that while work is made up of process, organizations are made up of people. And so that's what it's about. It's really about the people.
That's such a great story. I mean, you think about, how do you create more value, or how do you deliver more value? Value to her was quality time with dad, right? And it was like, now because of this, I get better and more quality time. That's all right. So that's probably one of the best stories that I've heard in this podcast ever. Right? That was awesome. So a little virtual high five. That was that touched my heart. I appreciate that, Jamie. Kind of shifting gears here to more of a hot seat type segment. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and I just want you to give that first answer that comes to your mind.
Okay. All right.
So, all right, here we go. It's like, so the first one is, do you have a lean or continuous improvement pet peeve that you frequently see being applied or being done wrong?
Yeah, so I think it's all of this focus on the technical aspects. So whatever it is, Gemba walks, tier 1 meetings, Kaizen event, anything. But it's like somebody says, hey, let's talk about Gemba walks. Like, well, how often should I do them? And what should my route be? And who should be there? And what's the agenda? And what does the board look like? Right? Same thing for anything. And I think we're asking the wrong questions. I think the question should be, well, how should I interact with people? How do I engage people? How do I ask better questions? How do I give encouragement, right? How do I support? How do I interact with people in that activity? And I never get asked those questions. And so I think we're asking the wrong questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So who do you want to, it's almost like you need to write out a list before you go on your walks. Is who am I going to engage with today? And what am I going to learn? Right.
Yeah.
It's what are my goals there? Yeah. That's a pet peeve for me too. All right. Good deal. What do you consider the most important thing that you've learned in your career journey so far?
Okay, so this is career and life. I have learned that I get to choose my thoughts.
Awesome.
So right, it's fascinating, right? Like, oh my gosh, wait. So often I think I have reacted from a place of anger or frustration, and realizing I don't have to choose that. Like I'm having a thought, right? I'm thinking something, I'm telling myself a story. It might be subconscious, and I get to choose a different thought, which can then create a different feeling, which leads to a different action and result.
Yeah, and our words matter, but the seed for the word is what starts in your head, right?
It is.
And whatever it starts in the head makes its way to the heart. So
yes.
that absolutely, it's thinking about we can't control everything in our environment, but we can completely control how we react to it.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about leadership, and when I think about leadership, it might be, a direct, leader management type role, but it could be indirect leadership, right? I'm an influencer and I'm a leader that way. Is that, think about the thoughts in your head that then frame your words, your nonverbal cues, all of that, and then the influence that it's then going to have for others, right? Because yes, they can choose their thoughts, but it just takes more awareness. It takes more action to choose your thoughts. So it's just the influence that we're having, and we get to choose. So yes, I know it can be frustrating and it can feel negative and it can be like, oh my gosh, here we go again. But you can choose a different thought, and it's just going to trickle so far away, right? Those waves, right? The ripples that we get to have.
Yeah. And one of the things I've learned, my wife is a human resources manager. And so you can imagine the situations and comments and the discussions that she has right now. And one of the best responses that I've learned from my wife and watching her in her professional life that, to take on for my professional life is you don't have to answer, right? When something comes up, it's okay to say, you know what, I want to reflect on that and think about that before I get back to you. And I'm like, that's so awesome because it puts in this pause that allows you to take emotion out of it and reflect on it and really deliver back something that's meaningful, right? And
Yes.
it is an answer, right? It's you know what, I need to reflect on that. And well, the first time I heard her do that, we were riding in the car and she said that on the phone. I was like, wow, I've totally, I need to do that more, right? I need to do that more in my own life with the people that I work with. Right?
Yeah, what a great takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out with continuous improvement? Maybe they've had a little bit of success, and but what if you had the opportunity to sit across from them? What would you tell them?
So I think I would say it's okay to go slower than you want to. I think sometimes we get started and there's all this stuff and we're so excited. And, oh my goodness. And we want to do this and we want to do this and I want to learn this. And we start to go really broad, but we don't really go deep with anything. And I find that a lot of that learning happens through the iterative process of going deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I would just, challenge or offer that as something to reflect on is, well, do I want to go broad? Do I want to go deep? And is it okay if I go a little bit slower than like I want to?
Yeah, well, it's a deliberative process. It's like it's iterative. What are you learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you building on it? I think that along the lines of that, I see a lot of people that they try to do way too much all at once, and there's nothing that's. It's like, hey, look at all this we're doing. So, okay, what's the one thing that you're best at, and just stick with that. Let's move through that first, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'll give you a story about this. So I have a client that I wasn't involved with them, 7 years ago, or whenever they kind of first started their practice. But 7 years ago, whenever it was, one of the things they put into place were some tiered daily meetings. And at some point over the years, they just kind of fell off, right? They either, different lines were either not doing them or they just became rote and we're just kind of standing up and repeating numbers, but they're not helping us make better decisions. They're not helping us raise problems. They're not helping us improve. And so they said, hey, you know what? We want to revisit this a little bit, but we're going to take a whole different approach. And so they're working, instead of going to all of the lines as a program, they've identified a few areas that they want to start with. But before they did that, they started with those mid-level managers and said, okay, well, let's build our skills and let's practice facilitating these type of meetings. And so a couple of times a week, they'd get into a room and they would practice with real numbers, but the leader would stand up and practice and then get feedback about how they're engaging and are they asking those open-ended questions? Are they giving answers? Are they doing too much directing and telling? What is that like? And so it's a much more deliberative process about what their goals are, which are to create awareness and engagement. And so they're really focused. And yes, it takes longer. It's going a lot slower, but it's more meaningful and impactful.
Yeah, and it's teaching them. I love the idea of practicing before performing, right? I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's that cycle of reflection. It's almost like a miniature PDCA or PDSA cycle before you actually run the experiment. So that's
Yeah.
awesome.
And one of these benefits that's so funny to watch is how much they're improving at receiving feedback and acting on it, right? So it's like, gosh, this is going to have such an effect in other areas because they're getting used to standing up and having people give correcting feedback and having to make adjustments on it that was really uncomfortable 3 weeks. Like 3 weeks ago, they were super defensive on it every time and they'd explain it away. And now they're really listening to it and taking it and acting on it.
Yeah, and kind of choosing our own thoughts and choosing our words and how our nonverbal cues show up. Someone I worked with, whenever they got feedback that they didn't like, they would say, "Thank you for your feedback," and it kind of came off as,
Yeah.
and so afterwards, talking to them, say, "Hey, can I share some observations? When you say it that way, I hear your words, but here's what your actions say," and they're, I didn't even think about that. But yes, I was feeling that. That's what that emotion was. And so just giving them that outside perspective as a third party observer to the conversation allowed them to, oh yeah, I need to think differently. I need to
Yeah.
react differently. So even
Yeah.
though you say thank you for the feedback, it really comes off as I'm not interested in what you say.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
so for someone that's further along in their journey, what piece of advice would you give to them?
So I think, let's see. So I guess I would say if you're further along in your journey, is seek out others' perspectives. So invite people in to your sandbox. Because I think sometimes we get further along and we feel like we start to know it and we feel like we're becoming more expert at it. And that is where sometimes it does become more difficult to take that feedback. And so I think that would be a good time to invite people into your sandbox, invite them to come in and give their perspectives.
That's great advice. Powerful. Do you have a favorite book or author or mentor that you would recommend to our listeners?
So I would say I have a favorite video, and that is so Simon Sinek. And yes, there's a book, but I just think the video is more powerful. So it's on YouTube. It's 99U, and it's Why Leaders Eat Last. And that was part of when I was going through my transformation. There were a lot of things happening at the same time, and that was one of those. It just really resonated with me, like, oh, I'm getting it, especially for someone like me who's very kind of black and white systems and process thinker. I'm not necessarily that creative thinker naturally, to start to understand more of those human elements in a way that just made sense for my brain.
I love Simon Sinek, and I will absolutely put a link to that video in the show notes page for this episode. I think everybody should check it out. And it's every time I listen to him, whether it's in a TED talk or something else, even though I've seen it before, I still pick up something new every time. Right.
Yeah.
So good deal. All right. So we all know that magic wands don't exist. Right. But if you did have a magic wand, and you could fix anything with a group that you're working with, what would be the first thing that you would wave the wand at?
So the first thing I would wave the wand at would be to develop the competency and a habit of leaders to give what I call reinforcing feedback. So reinforcing feedback is when we recognize the helpful behaviors, and particularly helpful behaviors that we'd like to see more of. But it really accomplishes a few things. First, it helps us connect the vision and the values and those big strategic things to everyday behaviors. Because too often these are posters on walls, right? And so people like, oh, we need to get those off the walls and into our culture. Like, well, yeah, this is how you do it. The second thing it does is it creates an environment where people feel valued. They understand how the work they do matters and what their contribution is. And then the third thing it really helps people adapt more easily. So you're going to have all of this change, that we're changing the way we're thinking, we're changing the way we're working. And so being able to do this helps people kind of adapt to those changes and make adjustments in their behaviors more easily. And it's one of those things that I think has like the biggest impact with the least amount of effort, and yet we don't do it. And I know we don't do it for two reasons. Number one, because studies show that when we ask people, US employees particularly, if they're about recognition, 82% say, I'm not recognized enough for my contributions. So if you ask managers, they say, oh yeah, I say thank you all the time. Well, 82% say, I'm not recognized enough. And they say specifically for my contributions. So they don't just want attaboys, they want to know that they're making a contribution. And the second thing is when I say this to a group, every single person nods their head. And I say, have you ever personally or ever heard someone say something like this? I do 10 things right, never hear a word. I do one thing wrong and never hear the end of it. Yep. Hands raised, heads nod.
Yeah.
Everybody has that experience or knows someone that has that experience or has heard this. And that's how I know we don't do this enough. And so if I had a magic wand, that would be it.
Great point. From other conversations I've been with in leadership, people talk about, they put R&R, rewards and recognition, and they put the reward part first. And it's almost like you need to flip those words, because you can't have the latter without the first. And if you don't do the first right, then the latter is meaningless, right? I mean, it's like, if you don't recognize first and then reward, and it's empty, it's hollow, right? And I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
a lot of organizations struggle with that.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that when like organizations or COOs come to me and they say, "Hey, we want help," they want help teaching their managers how to give correcting feedback. They need to learn how to give feedback. And, I say, like, gosh, you know what? I'm not going to teach them that until they first learn how to give reinforcing feedback. And really for two reasons. One is that if you learn it in reinforcing feedback first, it makes it a lot easier to learn how to give correcting feedback, right? Because it's the same basic idea. And so let's start with the easy part. But the second is that when you actually create an environment where leaders are consistently giving reinforcing feedback, then everybody is more open to correcting feedback. They know that it's not coming from this place of, 10 things right, never hear a word, one thing wrong, never hear the end of it. They know that feedback is just feedback.
Yeah.
It's not this big, massive problem.
Yeah, it's a statement, right?
Yeah.
It's so have you read Kim Scott's Radical Candor? If you
No,
haven't,
but it's on my bookshelf.
That book is awesome, right?
All right.
But it talks about the same thing as that. So on the book, it's got the cross on it, and the arrow up is care personally, and the arrow out is challenge directly. And the whole premise of it is that the more people believe that you care about them personally, the greater ability you have to challenge them directly. And it seems intuitive, but everybody misses it, right?
Yep.
And it's that's the difference between radical candor and like obnoxious aggression, right? Where it's just so it's when you're coaching with leaders and working through it with them, it's how much time do you spend for coaching for personal development versus coaching for improvement, right? Because if you don't have both of those, then it doesn't work, right? It's
Absolutely, yeah.
So you've got a lot of new projects going on. You are a fellow podcast host, which you have an awesome podcast that people should definitely check out. And then you have your company where you help with either on site, virtually. I think 2020 has taught all of us that results are more important than location.
Yeah.
And we've had to adjust a bit, but how can people connect with you if they want to learn more about what you do or if they have a question for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two best ways to connect with me are through LinkedIn, and I'm at Jamie V. Parker, V like Victoria, because it's a very common name. So Jamie V. Parker on LinkedIn, or you can go to my website, which is processplusresults.com. So that's all spelled out, processplusresults.com. There you'll find the podcast, which is Lean Leadership for Ops Managers. There's a schedule a call button. So if you want help, developing your leaders so that they build engaged teams, they integrate improvement into their culture, and really learn the people side of this lean, then you can schedule a call directly. And then there are also some additional free resources you can sign up for there at processplusresults.com.
I will put a link to that in the show notes page. Everybody should absolutely check that website out. It's incredible. That schedule a call, that's free. Like you're not charging for that. You just want to help, right? I mean, you just want to that. And I think it's kind of a low to no risk way to get that outside perspective that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jamie, thank you for your time on our podcast. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experiences with our leaders and the people that are listening to my podcast audience. And thank you for your time and your contributions.
Thank you for having me. This was a lovely conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to thank Jamie for being a guest on the podcast today. Make sure you go to the show notes page for this episode at leanleadershippodcast.com. There you'll find links for the books we discussed, the Simon Sinek video that Jamie mentioned, and how to connect with Jamie on LinkedIn, and links to her website and podcast, which you absolutely should check out. If you have a question for me or one of the guests or feedback on how we can improve the podcast, you can go to the podcast website and click on the microphone in the bottom right corner of the page and leave me a voicemail. That comes directly to me, and either I'll answer your question or I'll connect you with one of our guests that can answer your question for you. Thanks again, and remember, pursue progress over perfection.